Hi, I'm Jimmy. In this video, we're looking at my personal investment portfolio. So we're going to look at what sectors I'm invested in, how my portfolio has performed versus the S&P 500 over the past couple of years, and then I've actually got a new idea for a new investment portfolio I'll share with you towards the end of this video. Okay, so let's go through the different sectors that I'm in. Then we'll look at the performance of each of the holdings and how that compares relative to the S&P 500. So my smallest sector exposure right now is the healthcare sector, where I took a small position in CVS. So as we can see, CVS is about 2% of my portfolio. And by the way, the price you see within each of the boxes of the different positions is my average buy price. Okay, next up, we've got the industrial sector. So here I've got a defensive company called Lockheed Martin. This represents about 4% of my total portfolio. Then we jump into my final one sector holding, and that is the energy sector. This is Occidental Petroleum. This represents about 6% of my total portfolio. And Occidental, OXY, is actually one of my more recent purchases. But we'll come back to this one when we look at the performance of each of the holdings. Okay, next up, we've got the financial sector. So in the financial sector, actually two different holdings. I have PayPal, which represents about 2% of my portfolio, and Citigroup, which represents about 3% of my total portfolio. Okay, now we're getting over to some of my larger holdings. Next up, we've got two companies in the technology sector. So here I own Apple. This represents about 7% of my total portfolio. And then Microsoft, which is a bit over 10%, sitting at about 12% of my total portfolio. Then when we look at the consumer cyclical sector, well, here we've got two companies. We've got Ulta Beauty, which is about 8% of my portfolio. Again, a more recent purchase there. Then we have Alibaba, which represents about 10% of my portfolio. Then we have the largest sector in my portfolio, which is communication services. By the way, just to be clear about one thing about how these companies are classified as far as what sector they're in, this isn't a sector that I'm picking. This is how either the company classifies themselves or a data provider like Bloomberg or Morningstar, how they classify them. Just wanted to be clear. I'm not picking these sectors there. Either way, in the communication services sector, I've got Warner Brothers Discovery, about 3% of my portfolio. AT&T's 5%. Disney, 6%. Alphabet is about 11%. And then we have, by far, my largest holding, Meta, which is sitting right around 20%. So this is what my overall portfolio looks like right now. Now let's clean this up a little bit, get rid of some of the noise. And what's interesting about my personal portfolio is I actually loaded up on companies back in 2022 when the NASDAQ was down about 20% and the S&P 500 was down about 25%. In fact, these companies with check marks here, well, these are the companies that I bought. Most of them happened in 2022. Most of my big purchases happened in 2022. And as time went on, I averaged down throughout 2022. Now, since that time, largely thanks to many of the big purchases that I made back in 2022, well, when we jump over and look at a chart of performance of my portfolio versus the S&P 500. Now, I started this towards the end of 2022 when I was buying all these positions, and I did them relative to each other. So it was the S&P 500's performance and the performance of my portfolio since then. The interesting part here is that in the early days of 2022, when I first bought my shares, my portfolio actually underperformed versus the S&P 500, which probably tells us that I bought them a little bit too soon. They continued to fall a bit after that. But since then, they've made up a ton of ground and continued to climb, putting me way up above the S&P 500 since 2022. And just so we're on the same page, this performance includes all the holdings that I've had through this time period. So this includes stocks like Adcore. I recently did a video on Adcore. I exited out of Adcore. There was only about 1% of my total portfolio. So although it hurt my performance, didn't absolutely kill it. But this also includes investments like Intel, which I took a loss on. But I also had Activision Blizzard, which I bought at about $63 a share. Microsoft, I bought them in 2023. Shortly after that, Microsoft came in and acquired all of Activision Blizzard for about $95 a share. So I was up about 50% on that. So all of those, the losses and the gains, are included within this performance. So I don't think it's just the companies I bought in 2022. It's the entire portfolio from 2022 to now. Okay, now jumping back to my portfolio. Well, when we look at this, we can see that clearly, as you might guess, one of the big drivers of my performance has been Meta. Meta stock is up so much. In fact, let's jump over and look at a chart of Meta since this same time period. And we can see that this stock, even though it's pulled back recently in the past couple of weeks, it is up a massive amount. So we can see here that Meta's up more than 100% a year since I jumped in and bought it. Now, the interesting part about Meta is that this has had a massive impact on my portfolio because it is such a big piece of my portfolio. I have, back in 2022, I had averaged down multiple times to make to make Meta a large piece of my portfolio. Whereas a stock like Adcore that I was in was a very small piece because I wanted to see how it all played out. Meta, I was loading up on, along with companies like Apple and Microsoft. But this being 20% of my portfolio has done quite well. Now, back in 2022, it wasn't at 20%, but it was still a hefty chunk. It was at like 14, 15% of my portfolio. To illustrate how much this has impacted things, well, look at the big jump for Meta stock right during this time period. Well, then when we jump back to my investment portfolio, we can see that there's a direct correlation between the jump in Meta stock and the jump in my portfolio. Now, again, a lot of the bigger stocks that I've owned have done quite well. In fact, if we jump over to a table of the holdings within my portfolio, this table represents the weighting in my portfolio, the current weighting in my portfolio, as long as the total return for each of the stocks since I bought them. Now, one of the reasons that I've been fortunate that my portfolio has performed as well as it has over the past couple of years is because the larger positions that I have, the companies that I had the most confidence in as I was jumping in and buying them here, let's say all the ones that have a 10% or greater weighting within my portfolio, all of them have performed quite well. In fact, of the companies that performed not quite as well, the ones in red, well, first of all, two of them, Occidental and Ulta Beauty, are two more recent purchases. So I'm happy to sit on those and wait for them for a while. I like both of those companies. Warner Brothers Discovery, I actually got most of that position because I own AT&T, and I got, when they spun off Warner Brothers Discovery, that's how I ended up with that. And then CVS, that's been a struggle. That's probably worth a new video at some point in the near future to see what we should do with them. But again, the bigger positions that I own have done quite well, which is why when we jump back to the performance has been as good as it has been. Now, I want to point out that this is not unusual. If you look at a guy like Warren Buffett, or frankly, any big investor, any investor who tracks a portfolio, if you track your own performance, it is likely that a very small percentage of all of your holdings are driving the way, whether that be lower or higher. Usually, it's the biggest holdings that you have that matter the most. So with all that in mind, I'm actually going to launch a brand new portfolio. Similar to this, but this has always been intended to be my buy and hold portfolio. Ideally, I'm buying companies, doing deep dives on them, and then trying to buy and hold them for hopefully forever. Obviously, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you got to get out of positions if I was wrong or the company gets bought out or something like that. But now I'm looking to launch a new portfolio. Keep this one. This one's still going to be here. But I want to launch a new portfolio that targets holding more companies in it. This portfolio I've always targeted to own somewhere between, let's say, 10 and 20 companies. The new portfolio is going to target 40 to 50 companies. Those companies are intended to be high quality companies trading at a decent price, not quite as strict as I am with this portfolio, but still high quality companies trading at a decent price. But we're going to hold, let's say, 40 to 50 companies, and I can be a bit more fluid with it. If I want to take a profit, I can sell out of it. Again, with this portfolio, I've been just kind of sitting and waiting and trying to find new good companies to put into it. But I want to be a bit more active in the new portfolio. Now, I plan on keeping the very same rules in place that I have for this portfolio, which are I will not buy a stock in that portfolio or in this portfolio unless I first do a video on it and announce it. That way, everybody knows what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So that rule stays in place. But beyond that, yeah, I'm excited to launch this new portfolio. So you can hopefully expect a lot more videos from us in the near future, letting you know which companies I'm interested in, which ones I'm buying, which ones I think could fit in the new portfolio. And of course, if we find any really good ones, they'll end up in this portfolio. Now, thank you so much for sticking with me all the way to the end of the video. If you'd like to sign up to get access to our Investors Grow website, where we try to make it quick and easy to value companies, research companies, I will leave a link in the description below. And thanks so much for sticking with me. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.